The final pronouncement from Mr. Abernathy, her late father's solicitor, had the flat, dead finality of a spadeful of earth tossed onto a coffin lid. Lady Alara Vance sat perfectly still in the threadbare chair, her hands folded in her lap, her spine as straight as the iron poker, standing cold beside the empty hearth. To move, to even breathe too deeply, felt as though it might shatter the fragile composure she had so carefully assembled. "Insolvent, my lady," the solicitor repeated, his voice a reedy whisper of pity that she found more insulting than the news itself. "The debts are considerable. The estate, the house in town, all of it must be sold to satisfy the creditors. Insolvent. A word so sterile, so clinical, for the cataclysm that had just engulfed her world. Her father, the ever-charming, ever-optimistic Baron Ashworth, had not simply died. He had, it seemed, systematically dismantled their lives from the inside out, papering over the rot with a gentleman's smile and a steady hand at the card table. Ilara had known they were not wealthy, had understood the necessity of darning her own gloves and turning the collars on her gowns, but she had never suspected this. This was not genteel poverty. This was ruin. She thought of her younger sister, Clara, still at school in Bath, blessedly unaware. She thought of her mother's grave in the quiet churchyard, and for a fleeting, selfish moment, was grateful she was not here to witness this ultimate degradation. The Vance name, once respectable, if not grand, was now a byword for disgrace. "And what is to become of my sister and me?" Ilara's voice was low, but it did not tremble. She would not give Mr. Abernathy the satisfaction of seeing her break. The solicitor shuffled his papers, his gaze skittering away from hers. "There is very little. Once the debts are settled, you may find yourselves with £100 between you, perhaps less." He cleared his throat. "A position as a governess or a lady's companion might be suitable." A governess. The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. To go from Lady Alara Vance to a paid servant in another woman's house, subject to the whims of spoiled children and the condescension of a new master. A cold dread, far deeper than the April chill seeping through the window panes, settled in her bones. It was not the work she feared, but the loss of self, the final erasure of the life she had known. She thanked the solicitor, her manners an automatic, ingrained defense against the chaos churning within her. She walked him to the door of the small, rented room that served as his London office, her head held high. Only when the door clicked shut did she allow her shoulders to slump. She stood there for a long time, listening to the city's indifferent rumble, the clip-clop of horses, the distant cry of a vendor. Each sound was a reminder of a world that was moving on without her, a world in which she no longer had a secure place. The next 2 days passed in a fog of grim calculations and sleepless nights. She wrote to Clara, a carefully worded letter that hinted at difficulties but shielded her from the full, brutal truth. She walked the London streets until her feet ached, her mind racing through impossible scenarios, each one ending in the same bleak cul-de-sac of employment or charity. It was on the 3rd day that the letter arrived. It was delivered not by the common post, but by a liveried footman, whose presence outside her modest boarding house caused a flutter of curtains along the entire street. The envelope was thick, creamy card, sealed with a severe, imposing crest. A raven clutching a key, etched in black wax. The Duke of Blackwood. Ilara's breath caught. She knew the name, of course. Everyone did. Alistair Blackwood, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, was a figure of immense wealth, power, and tragic legend. He had withdrawn entirely from society some 3 years prior, following the sudden, shocking death of his young wife. He lived as a recluse on his vast, remote estate in the north, Blackwood Manor, a place spoken of in whispers, as if it were a fortress or a tomb. He was spoken of as a man hollowed out by grief, a cold, unapproachable spectre. Why on earth would such a man be writing to her? Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The note within was not from the Duke himself, but from his man of business, a Mr. Quentin Thorne. The script was precise, the language devoid of all pleasantry. It requested her presence at the Duke's London residence in St. James's Square the following afternoon at 2 o'clock to discuss a matter of mutual and urgent importance. Confusion warred with a nascent, terrifying hope. Mutual importance. What business could she possibly have with a man like the Duke of Blackwood? Perhaps he had known her father. Perhaps it was a matter related to the debts. She spent the rest of the day in a state of agitated suspense, her mind a whirlwind of speculation. She pressed her one good silk gown, a modest dove-grey creation, and prayed it would be sufficient. The next day, a heavy mist clung to the city, muffling sound and blurring the edges of the grand houses that lined the square. The Blackwood residence was a monolith of pale stone, its windows dark and inscrutable, like the eyes of a blind man. It seemed to absorb the light and sound around it, a pocket of silence in the heart of the bustling city. The door was opened by a butler who moved with the silent, solemn grace of an undertaker. He led her not to a bright drawing-room, but to a dim, wood-panelled library, where the air was thick with the scent of old leather and beeswax. And there he was. The Duke of Blackwood stood by the window, a tall, severe silhouette against the grey light. He turned as she was announced, and Ilara felt the air leave her lungs. He was younger than the rumours suggested, perhaps 30 years of age, but he carried himself with the gravity of a much older man. His face was a study in harsh, beautiful angles, as if carved from granite. His hair was as black as the raven on his crest, and his eyes, a startlingly pale grey, were utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a man who had seen something terrible and had never quite looked away. He was dressed in immaculate, unrelieved black, a stark figure of mourning that seemed permanent. "Lady Ilara," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, as cold and clear as a winter river. There was no greeting, no preamble. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." He did not sit himself, but remained standing, a formidable, unmoving presence that dominated the room. Ilara sank into a leather armchair, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was not a social call. This was an audience. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries, my lady," the Duke began, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "I am aware of your circumstances, the death of your father, the financial unpleasantness that has followed." A hot flush of shame crept up Ilara's neck. He knew. Of course he knew. A man like him would have ways of knowing everything. "I have a proposition for you," he continued, his tone utterly flat, as if he were discussing the purchase of a new horse. "I require a duchess. My daughter requires a mother. My household requires a mistress. I am not prepared to re-enter society to subject myself to the parade of hopefuls. It would be an inefficient and distasteful process." Ilara stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. A duchess? He was proposing. It was the most bizarre, impersonal, and chilling offer of marriage a woman could ever have received. You, Lady Alara, are a woman of impeccable breeding and reputation. You are, if you will forgive my frankness, in a position of considerable distress. This makes you a suitable candidate for a practical arrangement. He finally met her eyes, and the coldness in them was so profound, it was like a physical blow. I am offering you a title, a home, and complete financial security for you and your sister for the rest of your lives. I will settle your late father's debts in their entirety. Your sister's education and dowry will be assured. He paused, letting the magnitude of the offer settle in the silent room. It was a lifeline. It was salvation. It was everything she had secretly, desperately prayed for. And in return, she managed to ask, her voice a whisper. His expression did not change. In return, you will become my wife. You will be the Duchess of Blackwood. You will manage my home. You will act as a respectable and stable presence for my daughter. And you will perform the social duties required of your station, limited as they may be. You will have your own wing of the house. You will have your own fortune at your disposal. You will want for nothing material. He took a step closer, and the air grew colder still. But let me be unequivocally clear. This will be a marriage in name, and in name only. I will not offer you affection, nor will I expect it from you. My heart is not available for negotiation. Our lives, under the same roof, will be entirely separate. I require a partner in duty, not in life. Do you understand these terms? Ilara looked at the man before her, a monument of grief and ice. He was offering her a gilded cage, a life of luxurious emptiness. He was offering to save her from ruin, but at the cost of any hope for love, for warmth, for a true partnership. It was a devil's bargain, presented in the quiet, somber library. She thought of Clara's bright, untroubled face. She thought of the shame of the word governess. She thought of the cold, gnawing fear that had been her constant companion for days. What choice did she have? A life of cold security was infinitely better than a life of certain destitution. She met his chilling grey eyes with a steadiness she did not feel. She lifted her chin, a small, defiant gesture of self-preservation. "I understand your terms, Your Grace," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "And I accept." The journey north was a blur of grey skies and relentless rain that lashed against the carriage windows, mirroring the turmoil in Ilara's own heart. The Duke had not accompanied her. After their stark interview, he had vanished back into the shadows of his London house, leaving all arrangements to the efficient and unnervingly discreet Mr. Thorne. The contracts were drawn, the debts were settled with breathtaking speed, and a quiet, almost secret wedding ceremony was conducted by special license in a dusty city church, attended only by Mr. Thorne and Ilara's bewildered aunt. The groom had been a statue of cold courtesy, his vows spoken in that same flat, emotionless tone. He had placed a heavy gold band on her finger, his touch brief and impersonal, as cold as the metal itself. And then he was gone, back to his carriage, leaving her to follow in her own. Her new husband had informed her, via a note from his secretary, that he would see her at Blackwood Manor in a fortnight. He had business to conclude. So she travelled alone, a duchess in name, a stranger in reality, towards a home she had never seen and a life she could not begin to imagine. The landscape grew wilder, the hills turning to rugged, windswept moors that rolled under a sky the color of slate. It was a beautiful country, in a stark and melancholy way, but its bleakness did little to lift her spirits. It felt like an exile. Blackwood Manor appeared suddenly, materializing from the mist as the carriage rounded a final bend. It was not a house. It was a sprawling edifice of dark grey stone, crowned with a forest of chimneys and turrets, a Gothic giant brooding over the landscape. It was magnificent, imposing, and utterly without welcome. The wind howled around its gables, a mournful, lonely sound. As the carriage drew to a halt on the sweeping gravel drive, Elara felt a profound sense of isolation wash over her. This was her cage. The great oak doors swung open, and a line of servants stood assembled in the cavernous entrance hall. At their head was a severe-looking woman in her 50s, dressed in black bombazine, her grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to strain her features. Her posture was ramrod straight, her expression unreadable. "Your Grace," the woman said, her voice crisp and formal as she executed a shallow curtsy. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Welcome to Blackwood Manor." There was no warmth in the greeting. Elara, now the Duchess of Blackwood, felt like an interloper, an actress playing a role for which she had not been properly rehearsed. She offered a small, polite smile, the gesture feeling weak and inadequate in the vast, echoing space. The hall was panelled in dark oak that seemed to swallow the light from the high, arched windows. A massive stone fireplace, large enough to roast an ox, stood cold and empty. Portraits of generations of Blackwoods stared down from the walls, their expressions ranging from haughty to grim. Their eyes seemed to follow her, judging her. Mrs. Gable led her on a brief, perfunctory tour of the main rooms, the grand saloon, the ballroom with its shrouded chandeliers, the formal dining room that could seat 50. Each room was impeccably clean, perfectly preserved, and utterly lifeless. It was a museum, not a home. Dust covers draped the furniture in ghostly white shapes, and the air was still and cold, carrying the faint, sad scent of potpourri and time. "His Grace occupies the east wing," Mrs. Gable stated, gesturing vaguely towards a long, dim corridor. "Your apartments are in the south wing. They were prepared for you." The slight hesitation in her voice was telling. These were not the traditional rooms of the Duchess. "And the west wing?" Elara asked, noticing a heavy, bolted door at the far end of the upper gallery. A shuttered expression fell over the housekeeper's face. "The west wing is closed, Your Grace." The finality in her tone forbade further questions. It was a locked door, both literally and figuratively. Her own rooms were spacious and luxurious, with a large canopied bed, a comfortable sitting area, and windows that overlooked a vast, formal garden, its geometric patterns blurred by the persistent rain. A young, rosy-cheeked maid named Anna was assigned to her, her nervous deference a stark contrast to Mrs. Gable's rigid formality. "And the Duke's daughter?" Elara asked, as Anna helped her unpack. "I have not yet had the pleasure of meeting her." Anna's cheerful expression faltered. "Lady Rosalind. She keeps to the nursery wing, mostly, Your Grace, with her governess, Miss Finch." She lowered her voice. "She is a quiet child." The description proved to be an understatement. Later that afternoon, Elara was escorted to the nursery. It was a large, airy room at the top of the house, filled with expensive toys that sat untouched on their shelves. A stern-faced woman with spectacles perched on her nose rose as she entered. This was Miss Finch, and sitting in a small chair by the window staring out at the rain-streaked glass, was a small, pale girl of about 6 years old. She had her father's black hair, but it was fine and wispy, framing a delicate, heart-shaped face. Her eyes, however, were not the Duke's startling grey, but a deep, dark blue. They were eyes that seemed to hold an ocean of silent sorrow. She did not turn when Ilara entered. She did not acknowledge her presence at all. "Lady Rosalind," Miss Finch said, her voice sharp, "the Duchess is here. Make your curtsy." The child slid from her chair, her movement slow and listless. She dipped into a small, perfect curtsy, her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not speak. "Hello, Rosalind," Ilara said, her voice gentle. "I am Ilara. It is a pleasure to meet you." The girl said nothing. She simply remained there, a tiny, tragic doll, until Miss Finch gave a curt nod, and she returned to her chair by the window, resuming her vigil over the rain-drenched world. Ilara's heart ached for the little girl. This was the child she was supposed to mother, this silent, sorrowful wraith. The challenge felt immense, perhaps even more daunting than navigating the coldness of her new husband. The Duke arrived 2 weeks later, as promised. He appeared without fanfare, his arrival announced only by the sound of his horse's hooves on the gravel. Ilara saw him from her window, a lone black figure dismounting and striding into the house without a backward glance. That evening, they dined together for the first time, the long mahogany table stretched between them like a desolate, polished wasteland. They were attended by a footman who moved with ghost-like silence. The Duke did not speak, save to ask her if her journey had been comfortable. He ate methodically, his attention fixed on his plate. He was a stranger sharing her table, a landlord in her new home. The silence was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from unspoken grief and iron-willed control. Ilara observed him over the rim of her wineglass. She noted the fine lines of fatigue around his eyes, the rigid set of his jaw. He was a man holding himself together by sheer force of will. What had happened in this house to break him so completely? The closed west wing, the silent child, the tomb-like atmosphere. It all pointed to a tragedy so profound it had poisoned the very air. After the meal, he rose. "I trust you are finding your accommodations satisfactory," he said, the words as formal as if she were a visiting dignitary. "They are. Thank you, Your Grace." "Good." He gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. "I spend my evenings in my study. I will not require your company." And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone in the cavernous dining room with the ghosts of Blackwood's past. She sat there for a long time, the untouched dessert cooling before her, the heavy gold band on her finger, feeling less like a symbol of marriage and more like the shackle of a prisoner. This was her new reality, a cold truce in a house of sorrows, with a husband made of ice and a child made of silence. Her duty, it seemed, was simply to endure. The days at Blackwood Manor settled into a monotonous, chilling rhythm. Morning would break over the moors, often veiled in a thick, spectral fog that crept right up to the windows, making the house feel like an island adrift in a sea of grey. Ilara would wake, be attended by the quiet Anna, and take her breakfast alone in a small, cheerless morning room. Her husband, the Duke, was a phantom. She would sometimes hear his footsteps in the corridor or catch a glimpse of his tall frame disappearing into his study, but he seemed to make a concerted effort to avoid her. Their shared dinners remained exercises in strained, silent formality, conversations clipped and impersonal, limited to the weather or a question about the estate that required only a simple answer. She learned his routines through observation. He rose at dawn, rode out for hours across the moors regardless of the weather, and then closeted himself in the east wing with estate papers and ledgers. He was, by all accounts, a meticulous and responsible duke, managing his vast holdings with an almost obsessive precision. It was a duty he performed with the same cold efficiency he applied to everything else, a way to structure the emptiness of his days. Ilara's own duties were less defined. Mrs. Gable ran the household with an iron fist, her loyalty clearly belonging to the memory of the first Duchess, Isabel. The housekeeper treated Ilara with a correct, unyielding courtesy that was a form of passive resistance. Menus were brought for her approval, but she sensed they were the same menus that had been used for years. Questions about redecorating or changing the funereal atmosphere were met with a pursed-lipped silence, and the subtle implication that such changes would be a desecration. Ilara was the mistress of the house, yet she felt like a guest on her best behavior, afraid to move a piece of furniture for fear of upsetting some unseen, sacred order. Her primary focus, her only real purpose in this gilded prison, became Rosalind. The child remained a puzzle, a fragile vessel of sorrow. Miss Finch, the governess, was a proponent of discipline and rote learning. She taught Rosaline her letters, her numbers, and her French verbs with a dispassionate firmness that left no room for warmth or imagination. Ilara would often visit the nursery, only to find Rosaline sitting by the window, her lesson, books lying open but unread, her gaze lost in the vast, empty sky. Ilara tried to engage her. She brought her picture books, a beautiful porcelain doll with clothes she had sewn herself, a small music box that played a sweet, tinkling melody. Rosalind would accept the gifts with a silent dip of her head, her small hands holding them for a moment before setting them aside, untouched, forgotten. She never spoke a word, not to Miss Finch, not to the maids, and not to Ilara. According to Anna, she hadn't spoken much at all since her mother's death. Frustrated by the sterile confines of the nursery, Ilara began to look for another way to reach the child. Her explorations of the house and grounds led her to the south side of the manor, beyond the formal, manicured lawns. There, hidden behind a high stone wall and a heavy, ivy-choked oak door, she found it, a forgotten garden. It must have once been beautiful. A crumbling stone bird bath stood in the center, green with moss. The faint outlines of paths were still visible beneath the riot of weeds and thorns. Overgrown rose bushes, wild and tangled, clawed at the walls, their few remaining blooms small and pale, starved of light and care. It was a place of profound neglect, a secret, sorrowful heart of the estate. It felt, to Ilara, like a perfect metaphor for the house itself and for the family within it. A place that had once known love and life, now left to decay. An idea began to form, a small, quiet act of rebellion against the stifling inertia of Blackwood Manor. She would bring this garden back to life. She asked for tools, a request that was met with a raised eyebrow from the head gardener, a craggy old man named Mr. Hobbs. He clearly thought it a foolish whim of the new Duchess, but he provided a spade, a trowel, and a pair of thick leather gloves. Her first afternoon in the garden was one of back-breaking, frustrating work. The weeds were deep-rooted, the thorns on the neglected roses sharp and vicious. But as she worked, her hands raw and her back aching, she felt something she hadn't felt since arriving, a sense of purpose. She was not just clearing weeds, She was imposing order on chaos, tending to something broken. She worked every afternoon that the weather allowed. She expected Rosalind to remain in the nursery, a silent observer from the window. But on the third day, as Ilara knelt, wrestling with a particularly stubborn patch of nettles, she sensed a small presence. She looked up to see Rosalind standing in the open doorway of the garden, a small, hesitant silhouette. She did not approach, but simply stood and watched, her large blue eyes following Ilara's every move. Ilara did not call out to her or try to coax her in. She simply acknowledged her with a small smile and returned to her work. The child stayed for almost an hour before retreating as silently as she had come. This became their new ritual. Ilara would work, and Rosaline would watch from the threshold. The distance between them was a chasm of grief and fear, but there was a connection in the shared silence, in the simple act of watching and being watched. Then, one afternoon, a week later, something shifted. Ilara was trying to prune a particularly overgrown climbing rose, its branches a tangled mess far out of her reach. She let out a small sigh of frustration. A moment later, she saw a small movement out of the corner of her eye. Rosaline had stepped into the garden. She walked slowly, hesitantly, to a small, forgotten trowel lying half-buried in the dirt. She picked it up, her movements deliberate, and walked over to Ilara. Without a word, she held it out. Ilara's heart stopped. She took the tool, her fingers briefly brushing the child's small, cool hand. "Thank you, Rosalind," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Rosalind did not reply, but she did not retreat. Instead, she sat on a small, moss-covered stone bench nearby and continued her silent watch, now from within the garden's walls. She had crossed a threshold. From that day on, she was Ilara's silent companion. She would sit and watch, and sometimes she would help in small ways, pulling a small weed, carrying a handful of pebbles, pointing to a flower bud Ilara had missed. They worked in a comfortable quiet, a fragile peace settling between them amidst the scent of damp earth and crushed leaves. Ilara learned the contours of the child's silence, the way a slight widening of her eyes meant surprise, or a small frown meant she was studying a beetle on a leaf. They were slowly, painstakingly, clearing away the thorns and weeds, both in the garden and in the quiet spaces of their own hearts. Ilara knew the Duke was aware of her project. She felt his eyes on her sometimes from the window of his study, which overlooked the grounds. He never mentioned it. He never acknowledged the slow transformation taking place in the forgotten corner of his estate, nor the one taking place in his silent, watchful daughter. But she felt his gaze, a distant, unreadable scrutiny. He was observing, just as Rosalind had, from a safe and silent distance, and Ilara continued to work, her hands in the soil, praying that she was planting a seed of hope in this desolate, lonely place. The late summer sun cast long golden shadows across the lawn as Ilara knelt in the dirt, her fingers gently firming the soil around the base of a newly transplanted lavender bush. The air was sweet with the scent of thyme and chamomile, a stark contrast to the musty, closed-off perfume of the manor's interior. The walled garden was no longer a tangle of neglect. Paths had been cleared, the stone bench scrubbed clean of moss, and neat rows of herbs and hardy perennials were beginning to fill the beds that had been choked with weeds for years. It was still a work in progress, a place of quiet potential rather than lush abundance, but it was alive. Rosalind sat nearby, carefully arranging a collection of smooth grey stones into a circle. She was humming, a tiny, tuneless sound that was, to Ilara's ears, more beautiful than any symphony. It was a sound of tentative contentment, a sound that had been absent from this house for far too long. A ladybug crawled onto the back of the child's hand, and she watched it, her expression one of solemn fascination, until it flew away. A fleeting ghost of a smile touched her lips. It was this image, the quiet child, the fledgling garden, the soft, forgiving light of dusk, that the Duke of Blackwood saw as he approached, his footsteps silent on the newly laid grass path. Ilara did not notice him until he was standing just a few feet away, a tall, dark figure whose shadow fell over her work. She looked up, startled, shielding her eyes against the setting sun. "Your Grace," she said, her heart giving a small, nervous flutter. He so rarely sought her out, especially here, in this space she had claimed as her own. He did not reply immediately. His gaze moved from her face, smudged with a streak of dirt, to his daughter on the bench. He watched Rosalind for a long moment, his expression unreadable, carved from stone. But Ilara, who was becoming a student of his subtle tells, saw something in the taut line of his jaw, a flicker of emotion in the depths of his grey eyes. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was a crack in the ice, surprise, perhaps, or a reluctant acknowledgement of the scene before him. "You have been industrious," he said finally, his voice the usual low baritone, but lacking its customary sharp, cold edge. "It needed tending," Ilara replied simply, rising to her feet and brushing the dirt from her skirts. He looked around the garden, his eyes taking in the cleared beds, the pruned roses, the small pots of seedlings waiting to be planted. "My late wife, she designed this garden." The admission was quiet, almost swallowed by the evening air. It was the first time he had ever mentioned her, the spectral first Duchess, Isabel. The name hung between them, heavy and fragile. Ilara's breath caught. She had assumed as much, had felt the ghost of a feminine touch in the garden's original layout. But to have him confirm it, to have him volunteer this piece of his past, was monumental. "It has a beautiful structure," she said carefully, her tone gentle. "It would have been a shame to let it be lost completely." He nodded, his gaze distant, lost in a memory she could not access. She had a fondness for white roses. Ilara looked over at the climbers she had painstakingly untangled and tied to the wall. They were healthier now, covered in new green leaves with the promise of future blooms. "I will make sure to plant more of them," she said. His eyes returned to her, and for a moment the guarded mask slipped. He saw the scratch on the back of her hand, a thin red line from a stubborn thorn she'd battled that morning. His gaze lingered there for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "It seems you are waging a war against the thorns," he remarked. The corner of his mouth twitched, a barely perceptible movement that might, in another man, have been the start of a wry smile. It was the closest thing to humor, to any sort of personal, unscripted observation he had ever directed at her. The unexpectedness of it, the dry wit that hinted at a man buried deep beneath the ice, took her breath away. "The thorns, Your Grace," she replied, finding her voice, "are merely a defense for something beautiful. They must be handled with care, not aggression." His gaze held hers, and in the space of that shared look, something shifted. It was not a grand, earth-shattering change, but a small, subtle realignment, an acknowledgement, a moment of shared understanding in a silent, forgotten garden. He saw her not just as the Duchess, the functional component of their arrangement, but as the woman who had coaxed a smile from his silent daughter and life from his dead wife's neglected garden. Rosalind, who had been watching them with her usual quiet intensity, slid off the bench and walked over to Ilara. She didn't speak, but she slipped her small hand into Ilara's, her grip surprisingly firm. It was a simple, possessive gesture, an act of allegiance. The Duke's eyes fell to their joined hands. The expression that crossed his face was complex, a flash of pain, of longing, of something that looked almost like hope. He gave another stiff, formal nod, the mask of the cold, remote Duke sliding back into place. But the crack remained. "Dinner is at 8, he said, his voice once again clipped and formal. And then he turned and walked away, his long shadow stretching behind him until it was swallowed by the encroaching twilight. Ilara stood watching him go, Rosalind's small hand still warm in hers. It was not a victory, but it was a beginning, a single fragile bloom in the vast, frozen landscape of Blackwood Manor, a glimmer of the man he might be, or perhaps the man he once was. The fragile piece of the garden, that small pocket of burgeoning life, was shattered by the arrival of Lady Beatrice Finchley. She descended upon Blackwood Manor like a bird of prey, all sharp angles, rustling black silk, and a heavy scent of lilies that seemed to suck the very air from the room. Lady Beatrice was the sister of the late Duchess Isabel, and she carried her connection to the house's tragic past like a banner of holy martyrdom. Her visit, she announced upon her arrival, was to see her poor, darling niece, and to ensure that her sainted sister's memory was being properly honoured. From the moment she swept into the entrance hall, her critical gaze sweeping over Ilara from head to toe, it was clear that her true purpose was to inspect, to judge, and to undermine. She was a woman who thrived on the currency of grief, and she saw Ilara not as the new Duchess, but as a usurper. "So you are the replacement," she said, her voice dripping with a cloying, false sympathy that was far more insulting than open hostility. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a glint of malice. "I am the Duchess of Blackwood," Ilara replied, her tone even and cool. "Welcome to our home, Lady Beatrice." The Duke was, as ever, a remote and unreadable presence. He greeted his sister-in-law with a cold formality that betrayed no hint of affection or welcome. He endured her presence at dinner, a silent bastion against her torrent of chatter, which consisted mainly of saccharine reminiscences about Isabel and thinly veiled criticisms of the current state of the household. "Oh, Alistair, do you remember how Isabel used to fill this room with hot-house flowers? It seems so stark now," she would sigh, casting a pointed look at the simple bowl of wild heather Ilara had placed on the mantelpiece. Her primary target, however, was Ilara's relationship with Rosalind. Lady Beatrice positioned herself as the sole keeper of the child's well-being, the only one who truly understood the delicate nature of her grief. She was appalled to find Rosalind not in the nursery with her books, but in the garden, her hands smudged with dirt. "My word," she exclaimed, her voice a horrified stage whisper, as she stood at the edge of the garden, watching them work. "Alistair, you cannot allow this, letting the child grub about in the dirt like a common urchin. Isabel would be horrified. Her hands will be ruined." "She enjoys it," was the Duke's clipped, non-committal reply. Beatrice would not be deterred. She began a campaign of quiet sabotage. She would appear in the garden, bearing gifts of elaborate, frilly dresses for Rosalind, tutting about the state of her practical cotton pinafore. She would fill the child's head with stories of her mother, painting a picture of a perfect, angelic being that no living person could ever hope to compete with. She spoke of Isabel constantly, her voice hushed and reverent, turning the memory of the first Duchess into a weapon against the second. "Your mother had hands as white as milk, my darling," she cooed to Rosalind one afternoon, pointedly ignoring Alara. "She never sullied them with common labour. She was a true lady, a delicate flower." Alara saw the effect her words were having on the child. Rosalind grew more withdrawn, her tentative steps towards healing faltering. She would look at her own dirt-stained hands with a sense of shame, and the small, humming contentment she had found in the garden began to evaporate, replaced by a familiar, sad anxiety. The conflict came to a head one grey, blustery afternoon. Alara had been trying to coax Rosalind into planting a small row of pansies, but the child was listless, her attention elsewhere. Lady Beatrice swept into the garden, a batu apo shawl clutched dramatically around her shoulders. "I simply cannot allow this to continue," she announced, her voice pitched for maximum effect. "You are erasing Isabel's memory. This garden was her sanctuary, and you are turning it into some common vegetable patch." She gestured dismissively at the herbs Alara had planted. "I am bringing it back to life, Lady Beatrice," Alara said, her patience wearing thin. "It was dying. It was resting, in memory of its creator." Beatrice's voice rose. "You have no right. You are a stranger here, a placeholder bought to fill a space. You could never understand the depth of feeling, the tragedy that permeates this house. You are merely a convenience." The cruelty of the words, spoken so openly, struck Alara like a physical blow. She saw Rosalind flinch, her small face paling. But before Alara could form a reply, a voice, cold as the north wind, cut through the air. "That is enough, Beatrice." The Duke stood in the doorway, his face a thunderous mask. He had clearly overheard everything. He strode into the garden, his presence immediately shifting the balance of power. He came to stand not beside his sister-in-law, but slightly behind Alara, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of alliance. "Alara is the Duchess of Blackwood," he stated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Her authority in this house and in this garden is absolute. You will not question it again." Lady Beatrice stared at him, her mouth agape. She had clearly expected him to side with her, the guardian of his first wife's memory. "But Alistair, Isabel," she stammered. "Isabel is gone," he said, and the raw pain in those 3 words silenced her completely. "Alara is here. She has brought more life to this house in 2 months than you have with 3 years of your suffocating grief." He looked down at Rosalind, who was staring at her father with wide, uncertain eyes. "And she has done more for my daughter than anyone." The dismissal was total, the defense of Alara unequivocal. It was not a declaration of affection, but it was a declaration of loyalty. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the full, formidable weight of his authority. In that moment, they were not just 2 parties in a cold arrangement. They were a united front. Lady Beatrice paled, her malevolent certainty crumbling into shocked indignation. She drew herself up, her face pinched with fury. "I see," she said, her voice trembling. "I see I am no longer welcome in my own sister's home." "You are welcome as a guest, Beatrice," the Duke said, his tone leaving no room for argument. but you will afford the Duchess the respect she is due. Is that understood?" Without waiting for a reply, he turned his back on her and looked at Ilara. His grey eyes were dark with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Regret, anger, perhaps even a hint of apology. He gave her a single sharp nod, then turned and walked back into the house. Lady Beatrice, defeated and humiliated, shot Ilara a look of pure venom before sweeping out of the garden. The confrontation left the air vibrating with tension. Ilara knelt and put her arms around Rosalind, who was trembling slightly. The child leaned into her embrace, burying her face in Ilara's shoulder. It was the first time she had ever willingly initiated such physical contact. Holding the small, trembling girl, Ilara watched the spot where her husband had stood. He had defended her. He had chosen her side. An unwilling, uneasy alliance had been forged in the battleground of the Forgotten Garden. The shared challenge had forced them together, and for the first time, Ilara felt that perhaps this cold, cavernous house could, one day, actually become a home. Lady Beatrice, though cowed, did not retreat. She remained at Blackwood Manor, a simmering cauldron of resentment, her presence a constant, low-grade poison. She no longer confronted Ilara directly, but her disapproval was a palpable force, communicated through martyred sighs, pointedly sad glances at Isabel's portrait, and hushed conversations with Mrs. Gable that ceased the moment Ilara entered a room. Her final, most desperate act of malice was not aimed at Ilara, but through her. A few days after the confrontation in the garden, Beatrice sought out Rosalind in the nursery. Ilara, coming to fetch the child for their afternoon walk, paused in the doorway, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. Beatrice was kneeling before the little girl, her voice a sickly sweet whisper. In her hand she held a delicate silver locket. "This was your maman's, my darling," Beatrice was saying, her words slick with feigned tenderness. "She wore it always. She would want you to have it, so you never ever forget her." She fastened the chain around Rosalind's neck. "Some people," she continued, her eyes flicking towards the door where she must have sensed Ilara stood, "might want you to forget. They might want to dig up the past and plant something new in its place. But you must hold on to her memory, Rosalind. Promise me. Hold on tight so no one can ever take her away from you." It was a monstrous, manipulative act, dressing up emotional poison as a sacred duty. Ilara watched as Rosalind's small hand closed around the locket, her face tight with a terrible, confused burden. The effect was immediate and devastating. Rosalind retreated into a silence deeper and more absolute than any before. She refused to leave the nursery. She would not eat. She sat in her small chair, clutching the silver locket, her eyes wide and vacant. The tentative progress of the past months was obliterated. By nightfall, she was burning with fever, tossing and turning in her bed, muttering a single word over and over in a choked, delirious whisper. "Maman, maman." The house was thrown into a state of quiet panic. The local doctor was summoned, a portly, well-meaning man who diagnosed a severe nervous agitation and prescribed cool compresses and quiet. Miss Finch was useless, flustered, and out of her depth. Ilara dismissed her and took up the vigil at the child's bedside herself. She bathed Rosalind's forehead, tried to coax spoonfuls of water between her parched lips, and spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur, though the child seemed not to hear. Late that night, the door to the nursery creaked open. The Duke stood on the threshold, his face a stark, pale mask of anguish in the flickering lamplight. All the icy control, all the remote formality had been stripped away. He looked raw, haunted, and terrifyingly vulnerable. "The doctor said," he began, his voice hoarse. "She needs to rest," Elara said softly, not looking up from her task of smoothing the damp hair from Rosaline's forehead. "The fever is high." He came further into the room and stood by the bed, looking down at his daughter. The sight of her small, feverish form seemed to break something in him. He sank into the chair on the other side of the bed, burying his face in his hands. The sound he made was not quite a sob, but a low, wretched groan of utter despair. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the child's restless breathing and the storm that had begun to rage outside, the wind battering the windows and the rain lashing against the stone. The storm seemed an external manifestation of the turmoil within the room, within the man sitting opposite her. "This is my fault," he said at last, his voice muffled by his hands. "All of it. I thought I could contain the past, keep it locked away, but it's a poison. It seeps through the cracks." Elara waited, sensing that a dam of unspoken grief was about to break. He lifted his head, and his grey eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a pain so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. "Beatrice should never have come back. I never should have allowed it." He looked at the locket still clutched in Rosalind's hand. "That locket. I gave it to Isabel the day this happened." The air in the room grew thick, heavy with impending revelation. Elara held her breath. "It was a night like this," he began, his voice low and ragged, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window as if he were seeing the past played out against the glass. "A terrible storm. We were in her sitting room, in the West Wing. We were arguing. It was a foolish argument about some trip to London I didn't want to take. Trivial." He gave a bitter, self-deprecating laugh that held no humor. "She was spirited, passionate. She hated this house, this isolation. She felt trapped." He fell silent, and Elara could almost hear the echoes of the argument, the raised voices against the backdrop of the storm. "She went out onto the balcony for some air," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "To get away from me. The railing. It was old stone, slick with rain. I told her to come back inside. She was angry. She turned back to say something, and she slipped. The simple, brutal words hung in the air." Elara closed her eyes, a wave of sickness and sorrow washing over her for the vibrant, angry woman she had never known. "I ran to her," the Duke said, his voice cracking. "But it was too late. She fell. Right there, in the courtyard below." He gestured vaguely towards the window. "I held her, but she was gone. One moment she was there, vibrant and furious and alive, and the next—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He drew a shuddering breath. Rosalind was in her nursery, just down the hall. She heard the screaming. She saw me carrying her mother back inside. She was only 3. Now Elara understood. The locked West Wing was not just a memorial. It was a tomb, the scene of the horror. Rosalind's silence was not just grief. It was the trauma of a witness, a child who had seen something no child should ever see. And the Duke's coldness was not a lack of feeling. It was a shell of guilt, the self-flagellation of a man who believed a foolish argument had led to his wife's death. He had locked away the West Wing, locked away his heart, locked his daughter away from the world, all in a desperate, misguided attempt to protect them from a memory that could not be contained. "I failed her," he whispered, the words raw with 3 years of unspeakable guilt. "I failed Isabel, and now I am failing my daughter." He looked at Ilara then, his defences utterly shattered. He was no longer the formidable Duke of Blackwood, but a man drowning in grief, his guilt a stone dragging him under. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small lamplit room, a different kind of storm had just broken. The truth, in all its devastating, tragic detail, was finally out. In the face of such raw, monumental grief, there were no words of comfort that would not sound hollow, no platitudes that could possibly suffice. Ilara did not offer them. Instead, she reached across the small space separating them, across the bed where his sick child lay, and placed her hand over his. His hand was clenched into a fist on his knee, a knot of tension and despair. Her touch was light, a simple, steady point of contact in the maelstrom of his guilt. He flinched at first, as if burned, so unused to any form of gentle, human comfort. But he did not pull away. After a long moment, the tension in his hand slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to ease. His fingers uncurled, and his hand turned, his palm meeting hers. It was the first time they had ever touched with any true meaning, a silent acknowledgement of a shared burden. They sat like that for a long time, two solitary figures connected in the dim light, while the storm outside gradually spent its fury, and the child between them drifted into a deeper, more peaceful sleep. As the first watery light of dawn began to filter through the window, painting the room in shades of grey and lavender, Rosalind's fever broke. Her breathing evened out, the frantic restlessness ceased, and a fine sheen of sweat cooled on her brow. The crisis had passed. Alistair, Ilara found herself thinking of him as Alistair for the first time, let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. He looked utterly exhausted, his face pale and drawn, but the terrible, haunted look in his eyes had softened, replaced by a profound weariness. He looked at Ilara, at her hand still covering his, and his expression was one of dawning, incredulous gratitude. He saw not the duchess of their arrangement, not the stranger in his house, but the woman who had sat with him through the darkest night of his soul, who had met his confession not with judgment or pity, but with quiet, compassionate strength. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying a weight of meaning that went far beyond the simple courtesy. Ilara simply squeezed his hand in reply. Later that morning, after Ilara had finally persuaded him to get some rest, a footman delivered a sealed note to Lady Beatrice's room. Ilara did not know what it said, but an hour later, Lady Beatrice's carriage was brought around to the front of the manor. She departed without a word of farewell, her face a mask of cold fury, her poisonous presence finally excised from the house. The atmosphere at Blackwood began to change, slowly but perceptibly. The oppressive weight that had seemed to suffuse the very stones of the manor began to lift. It began with the West Wing. A few days after Rosalind was back on her feet, pale but no longer feverish, Ilara found Alistair standing before the heavy, bolted door, a large iron key in his hand. "It's time," he said, his voice quiet. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. He was not commanding her. He was inviting her. She nodded, and together they opened the door. The air that billowed out was stale and sad, the scent of dust and faded perfume. Sunlight struggled through the grimy windows of the long corridor. With Ilara by his side, Alistair walked through the rooms for the first time in 3 years. He did not speak much, but he pointed out Isabel's sitting room, the small desk where she wrote her letters, the music room with her harp still standing under a dust sheet. It was a pilgrimage of memory, but with Ilara there, it was not a solitary one. It was an exorcism of ghosts. That afternoon, he gave Mrs. Gable the order. The west wing was to be opened, aired, and cleaned from top to bottom. The housekeeper, seeing the Duke and Duchess standing together, a united and resolute pair, finally seemed to accept the new order of things. Her rigid formality softened into a respectful, efficient cooperation. Rosalind, too, began to heal. The fever seemed to have burned away, the worst of the trauma. Or perhaps it was the change in her father, the lifting of the suffocating grief that had blanketed the house. Alistair began to spend time with her, real time. He would join her and Ilara in the garden, his presence at first tentative, almost shy. He would watch them work, and then one day he picked up a trowel and began to weed a bed alongside them, his movements clumsy at first, but determined. He started reading to Rosalind in the evenings, his deep voice filling the nursery, as he read tales of dragons and brave knights. One evening, as he finished a chapter, Rosaline, who had been listening intently, pointed to a picture on the page. "Again," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken in weeks, the first request she had made of her father in years. Alistair froze, his knuckles white on the cover of the book. He looked at Ilara over the top of the page, his eyes shining with an emotion so fierce and bright it stole her breath. He cleared his throat and, his voice thick, he began to read the chapter again. The silent, formal dinners became a thing of the past. They began to take their meals together, the three of them, in the smaller, more intimate morning room. The long, polished table in the grand dining hall remained empty. Their conversations were no longer stilted or formal. Alistair would talk about the estate, asking for Ilara's opinions on plans for a new tenant farm or the breeding of his horses. He discovered she had a keen, practical mind, and he began to rely on her judgment. She, in turn, would tell him about her plans for the garden and about the small, funny things Rosalind had done that day. They started spending their evenings together in the library. The fire would be lit, casting a warm, flickering glow over the rows of books. They would sit in the comfortable leather armchairs, sometimes reading in a companionable silence, other times talking late into the night. She learned about his childhood, his passion for architecture, his dreams for the estate before the tragedy had derailed them. He learned about her life, her love for her sister, her quiet strength and resilience. In these quiet moments, the last of his icy reserve melted away. She saw the man he was meant to be, intelligent, thoughtful, with a dry wit that surfaced more and more frequently. He would watch her, a soft, wondering look on his face, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. The cold, loveless arrangement had transformed, without either of them planning it, into a deep and genuine friendship, and for Ilara, it was blossoming into something far deeper. She was falling in love with her husband. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had no idea if he felt the same, and she was too afraid to hope. The terms of their original bargain still hung, unmentioned, in the air between them. A partnership in duty, he had said. Nothing more. One crisp autumn morning, a letter arrived, bearing a parliamentary seal. Alistair read it at the breakfast table, his expression growing grim. "What is it?" Elara asked, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. "I have to go to London," he said, his voice flat. "There is a vote on the reform bill that cannot be missed. I will be gone for at least a month." London. The word fell like a stone into the comfortable peace they had built. It represented the outside world, the duties and obligations that existed beyond the sheltered walls of Blackwood. It felt like a threat, a return to the past, to the distance and formality that had once defined them. The change in him was immediate. He became preoccupied, the old mask of the efficient, remote duke slipping back into place as he began issuing orders for his departure. He was not cold to her, not as he had been, but a subtle distance returned, a preoccupation that excluded her. He spoke of his travel arrangements, of the papers he needed to pack, of the meetings he would have to attend. He was retreating back into his role, and Elara felt a familiar, chilling sense of isolation begin to creep back in. The day of his departure was grey and overcast, the sky threatening a cold rain. The carriage was brought to the front of the manor, the horses stamping impatiently. His bags were loaded. The staff lined up in the hall to see him off. He was once again the formidable Duke of Blackwood, dressed in severe, dark travelling clothes, his face set in a formal, unreadable expression. He said his goodbyes to Rosalind, who clung to him, her face buried in his coat. "I'll be back before the first snow, I promise," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. He handed her to Elara, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, electric moment. He turned to Elara. She stood clutching Rosalind's hand, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had prepared a polite, composed farewell, the farewell of a duchess seeing her duke off on important business. She would not let him see the turmoil inside her, the desperate fear that this departure would reset their relationship back to its cold, sterile beginning. "I trust you will manage everything in my absence," he said, his voice formal, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, the honorific feeling like a slap. He looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tight, as if there were words he wanted to say but could not or would not form. Then he gave a curt nod. "I'm leaving for London," he said, the words a stark, formal declaration. It sounded like a final judgment, a reassertion of their original terms. He turned and strode out the great oak doors without a backward glance. Elara stood frozen in the hall, watching through the open door as he walked down the steps. A cold wind swept in, carrying the scent of rain and dead leaves. She watched him walk across the gravel drive towards the gate where his carriage waited. Each step he took away from her felt like a physical blow. This was it. It was over. The warmth, the connection, the burgeoning hope. It had all been a temporary reprieve, an illusion conjured in the isolation of the manor. He was returning to his world, and she was being left behind in hers. She saw him reach the wrought iron gates. His foot was on the carriage step. He paused, his back still to the house. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a tall, unmoving figure against the bleak landscape. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, irrational hope warring with the cold certainty of her despair. Then slowly he turned. He didn't look at the carriage or the driver. His gaze was fixed on the open doorway of the manor, where she stood silhouetted, holding his daughter's hand. He looked at them, and the carefully constructed mask of the Duke finally shattered, not into pieces, but into an expression of such raw, aching clarity that it made her gasp. It was a look of sudden, profound realization, as if he was seeing his own heart for the first time and realizing he was about to leave it behind. He took his foot off the step. He said something to the driver, a sharp, decisive command. And then he started walking back towards the house. He was not strolling, he was striding, his long coat billowing behind him, his steps eating up the gravel with an urgent, undeniable purpose. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from him. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, and he reached up, his touch impossibly gentle, and tucked it behind her ear. "I was a fool," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "I stood there, at that gate, and I thought about the vote in Parliament, about my duties, about the title I bear, and I realized that for the first time in my life, none of it mattered as much as what I was leaving behind." He looked from her to Rosalind, and then back to her, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "I made a bargain with you in that library in London, a cold, practical arrangement. I offered you everything, but the one thing that has any value. And you took that barren pact and you filled it with life. You tended to my daughter, you tended to my home, and you tended to me, with a grace and compassion I have done nothing to deserve." He took her hand, his grip firm and warm, lacing his fingers through hers. "This arrangement is no longer sufficient. This house is no longer just a house. It is our home, and I cannot bear the thought of it without you in it. I cannot bear the thought of me without you in it." He drew a deep, unsteady breath and laid his soul bare in the cold autumn air. "I love you, Ilara, not as a duchess, not as a partner in duty, but as the woman who walked into the ruins of my life and made the garden grow again. I love you." Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back began to stream down Ilara's face. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so overwhelming it was painful. All the lonely days, all the silent meals, all the patient, hopeful work had led to this one, perfect, impossible moment. "And I love you, Alistair," she whispered, the name feeling right and true on her lips. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across his face, a smile of such pure, unadulterated happiness that it transformed his harsh features into something beautiful. He leaned down and kissed her, there in the open doorway of Blackwood Manor, with the wind howling around them and his daughter watching with wide, knowing eyes. It was not a kiss of polite affection or hesitant friendship. It was a kiss of profound, desperate, and absolute certainty. It was the sealing of a new bargain, one made not of duty and convenience, but of a love that had taken root in the most desolate of soils, and had, against all odds, blossomed. He was not leaving for London. He was home. The following spring arrived at Blackwood Manor not as a hesitant guest, but as a joyful, conquering army. Sunlight, rich and golden, poured through the newly cleaned windows of the west wing, banishing the last of the shadows. The air, once heavy with silence and sorrow, now carried the sound of Rosaline's laughter as she chased a cabbage-white butterfly across the lawn, her black hair flying behind her like a silken banner. The walled garden was a symphony of colour and life. The white roses Alistair's first wife had loved climbed the ancient stone walls, their blossoms heavy and fragrant, mingling with the deep purple of the lavender and the cheerful faces of the pansies, Rosalind had finally planted herself. It was no longer a place of memorial, but a place of living, breathing beauty, a testament to the healing power of patient, loving hands. Elara stood on the path, watching her, their daughter, a contented smile on her face. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of her husband's chest. Alistair rested his chin on her shoulder, his gaze following hers to the laughing child. "I received a letter from your sister this morning," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble against her ear. "She is enjoying her tour of Italy immensely and sends her love. She also included a rather alarming sketch of a Roman statue she believes bears a striking resemblance to Mr. Abernathy." Elara laughed, a full, free sound. "Clara has always had a wicked sense of humour. I'm so grateful to you, Alistair, for giving her that freedom, that joy." "It is you I should be grateful to," he murmured, turning her in his arms to face him. He looked down at her, his pale grey eyes, once so cold, now filled with a deep and abiding warmth. "You gave me back my life, Elara. You gave me back my daughter. You taught me that a house is just stone and wood, but a home is built from love." He still carried the scars of his past. She knew. Grief is not a wound that ever truly disappears, but becomes a part of who you are. Yet it no longer defined him. The guilt had been replaced by a quiet acceptance, the sorrow softened by the profound happiness he had found in his new life with her. He was no longer a man made of ice, but one forged in fire and remade by love. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of shared mornings and quiet evenings, of absolute trust and endless affection. Rosalind, abandoning her butterfly chase, ran to them and threw her arms around their legs, her small, happy face pressed against them. Alistair reached down and scooped her up, settling her on his hip. And there they stood, the three of them, a family, whole and healed, framed by the blooming garden under the bright, benevolent sun. The ghosts of Blackwood Manor had not been banished. They had simply, finally, been laid to rest, making way for the vibrant, joyful life that had taken their place. Dear listener, isn't it a curious thing how we sometimes build the highest walls not to keep others out, but to keep our own pain locked in? Like the Duke in our story, we can become prisoners in the fortresses of our own grief and guilt, believing that the only way to protect ourselves from further hurt is to shut down completely, to turn away from the very light and warmth that might heal us. We convince ourselves that the past is a locked room, a forbidden wing of our own hearts, and that to open the door is to risk being consumed by the darkness within. But as Lady Elara so beautifully demonstrated, healing rarely comes from a grand assault on those walls. It comes quietly, patiently. It comes in the form of tending to a neglected garden, one small, hopeful act at a time. It's the choice to plant a seed of kindness in a place that has long been barren, to offer compassion where there is only coldness, to simply be present with someone in their silence without demanding they speak. So often we wait for a grand gesture, a dramatic turning point, to begin to heal or to help someone else do the same. But life, like a garden, is cultivated in the small, consistent efforts. It's in the quiet act of reaching out a hand, of listening without judgment, of choosing to see the potential for beauty beneath the thorns and weeds. Perhaps there is a walled-off garden in your own life, or in the life of someone you care about, a place of past hurt that has been left to grow wild and untended. Don't be afraid to gently push open the gate. You don't need to have all the answers or a perfect plan. You just need to be willing to kneel in the dirt, to do the patient work of clearing away the debris, and to believe that even in the most neglected soil, something beautiful is waiting for its chance to grow. That is where true transformation is found, not in avoiding the pain of the past, but in bravely and lovingly tending to its grounds until it can bloom once more. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that no garden is ever truly beyond hope.